Last week, as DC reporters were patting themselves on the back for not falling for some nonsense on the internet that said Donald Trump had secretly died, Garrett Graff wrote an essay on his blog. It was titled, "It's Time to Have a Serious Conversation About Trump's Health." Graff is no crank. He's a journalist and historian who's spent more than 2 decades covering American politics, editing Washingtonian and Politico magazine. More recently, he's been writing oral histories on major world events and hosting critically acclaimed podcast series about the early days of the internet and the culture of armed self-defense. But now, Graff is worried that political reporters are failing to recognize the history they're currently living through. That this is in many ways an unprecedented time, with a president pushing the limits of executive power and constitutional democracy and leading us on a path that the past has not prepared us for. He joins the Kicker this week to talk about Trump's health and where he sees political journalism going wrong. Well, Garrett, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me today.
What made you write that piece? Why do you think this is something we need to stop and take more seriously?
I've been watching a number of different threads and sort of subplots of the Trump presidency over the course of this summer. And then, of course, as listeners probably remember, over the course of Labor Day weekend, there was this weekend of insane internet rumors about whether the president was still alive, whether, Trump was being weekend at Bernie'd.
Right.
And then when he, to sort of very few people's legitimate surprise, appeared alive at the end
Right.
of Labor Day weekend, the White House press corps was sort of oddly dismissive of the internet conspiracies over the weekend, and there was sort of an almost like triumphal tone in their coverage of, see what idiots all those people on the internet is. Of course Donald Trump is alive.
Yeah, we didn't fall for it.
We didn't fall for it, but they overlooked, and sort of the tone of the coverage felt inappropriate to me, given that there are very legitimate questions about Donald Trump's health that feel like they should be getting more attention and investigation from the Washington press corps, especially given that we have spent so much of this year lost in this weird shame cycle of self-flagellation about how the press corps was complicit in the cover-up of Joe Biden's mental and physical decline in the final year of his presidency.
Right.
And yet here we are just a year later, and the White House press corps seems just as uninterested in investigating the president's health as ever before.
Okay, I want to come back to that because I think it's a really important point that we should sit with a little bit, particularly from your vantage point as someone who both covers these things in real time and is a historian of major events. But just to sort of clarify, I mean, you're not a conspiracist, right? You're not suggesting that there's proof that he is currently dying of some heart condition or something. What's your take on his health right now based on what we know, or what do we need to know?
So I think my take is that I have no idea. I don't have any inside knowledge. I'm not a conspiracist. I don't have any AI enhanced long range photos that make me think the White House is using a body double. Like this, to me, it's sort of the opposite of all of that, which is there are these incidents and episodes that keep flaring up that the White House under pressure addresses, and then the press corps just takes at face value and moves on. We saw sort of 2 of them over the course of the summer. One, Donald Trump's oddly swollen ankles, and then his sort of bruised hands that
Right.
the White House just said, gosh, this guy is just such a man of the people. He's shaking so many hands that his hands are bruised.
Right.
But all of that is sort of set against, to me, the backdrop, which is we have less reliable information about Donald Trump's health than I think we have had about any president since John F. Kennedy in the 1960s.
Right.
And that all of the information that we have ever gotten about Donald Trump's health, both as a candidate and as president, has been filtered through these sort of odd sets of boasts and exaggerations that, the president's physician, declared him the healthiest person who would ever be elected to the White House at one point.
Right, I remember we
Um,
remember that, and when we saw that guy, right, we saw who
yes,
his doctor was back then. They were flags back in the early days.
exactly. And then we know that this is a White House and an administration that specifically has lied to the American people about the state of the president's health. That in his first term, we had this very odd, totally unexplained, unannounced visit to Walter Reed for some type of medical procedure that later came out in actually a Trump administration memoir, that it was basically a colonoscopy, a routine colonoscopy that Donald Trump just didn't want to tell anyone about.
Right.
And then when the president got COVID in 2020, we now know and now understand that he was actually in much more serious jeopardy than the American people were ever told at the time during that episode when, again, he was hospitalized and treated during his first term. So all of this adds up to me as exactly the type of thing that you would expect to raise the antenna of the Washington press corps. Here we have an area where the president is historically lied to us about, where there are visible signs that things are not well. And there is sort of recent media and political precedent for deeper investigation based on, Joe Biden's presidency. And
Right.
you would sort of think that all of that would add up to really any news organization taking these questions seriously. And yet, since July, there has not been a single serious follow up or investigation by any major media outlet into what is the status of the president's health. And to me, part of this, by the way, is, as your question sort of set this up, I don't know what the actual answer is.
Right,
But
right.
there are three distinct answers that could come out of this investigation, all three of which would be newsworthy. The first is the president is actually in robust, great health, as he might very well be. His father, after all, lived to the ripe old age of 93. And Donald Trump might have, a decade or two ahead of him. The second scenario one could expect to come out of this is, you know, Trump White House stonewalls health questions. That would be a very newsy headline and story for some news outlet to write. Then the third scenario is Donald Trump's health is actually worse than we believe publicly, and that there are sort of people around him who are worried about the status of his health. That would be a very newsworthy story to come out of this. And really, any of those three would add dramatic and important new information to both for the American public and for people around the world about the status of the American commander in chief at a time of geopolitical concerns
Mhm.
that would sort of help inform where we are as a country and as a world.
We did this story at CJR by my colleague Liam Scott, and I was struck by the fact that a lot of the White House reporters he spoke to, and by the way, there may be an investigation ongoing, right? It could come out this week, right? There could be someone doing it. But I was struck by how many of the people he spoke to who cover this took the position of sort of, yes, this is important, but, shrug emoji. we we don't know what we don't know, and we have to kind of wait to find out more. And their White Houses are secretive about this thing, and so it goes. I'm not suggesting that they're happy about it necessarily, but I was struck by a sense that, like you pointed out, a disconnect with how much self-flagellation there is about missing the Biden story. That now there seems to be not the same amount of self-flagellation, I guess, or concern.
Yeah, and that to me is just part of the puzzle of this, which is I think part of why I wanted to write my column was to lay out this case, lay out this evidence of why it would be sort of worth digging into these questions. And that, I can't really explain as someone who has covered Washington for 20 years myself why the all of the people that we would expect to be most interested in this subject professionally don't really seem to care in this moment.
I'm interested in something you write, which is this distinction between a news event and a news story, and I want to ask you to talk about that a little. But as you're saying that, isn't there a little bit of a comparison to what happens when a war starts, where you have the sort of press corps, despite knowing from the last war that we're probably being lied to about a lot of things, there's this tendency to fall in to, oh, well, there's this thing going on, and we've got to report what the White House is saying and the Pentagon is saying about it. I mean, to me, that's the pattern that keeps coming to mind.
Yeah, and I think as you said, I tried to draw this distinction in my piece that you know there's a difference between a news story and a news event. And one of the things that we know is that the press is very good at creating a news event when it wants to. Think Hunter Biden, think Hillary's emails. That there is days and days of repeat coverage, that there's wall-to-wall news coverage on the cable channels.
The definition of this term being essentially the news coverage is the story in itself, in a way.
Exactly. That the media says this is something that we're going to care about and we're going to make everyone else care about it too.
Right.
And it's clear that they don't think that Donald Trump's health is a news event. But it puzzles me even further that it doesn't even seem like the press corps is treating Donald Trump's health as a news story. And by the way, I would tell you that we saw the Washington press corps turn Joe Biden's decline and the quote unquote conspiracy around that over the course of the spring this year as Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson's book came out, that you saw exactly that kind of wall-to-wall cable coverage and sort of day after day repeat news coverage, trying to get to the bottom of it, discussing the implications of it, discussing the responsibility for it. And so it's weird to me that we have already had a news event this year about a previous president's health, and not even in this moment have the media treat Donald Trump, the current president's health, as even a news story.
So what's your thesis, though? Like, why is it why does this happen?
To me, it's two things. One is I think that the Washington press corps, the White House press corps, sort of still doesn't really understand how to cover Donald Trump.
Mhm.
And that we let Donald Trump get away with a whole bunch of things that no one else would ever be able to get away with simply because he's Donald Trump. And, this is a White House that lies about things big and small all the time for no reason at all. And so, there's sort of a built in level of assumption that they're lying about all things. And so, sort of, any one lie isn't necessarily worth that digging into or trying to get into too deeply.
This is the fundamental problem of covering Trump, right?
Right. And then I think the second thing is it's a press corps that is still too focused on access.
Mm.
And, we've seen how the Associated Press is, still locked in this battle over the Gulf of America versus the Gulf of Mexico. And we saw how the White House Correspondents Association and the White House press pool did not rally to the AP's side during that showdown earlier this year. And I think that there is just still this very strong group think and bias towards access that paralyzes the press corps from being willing to take on some of these topics that Donald Trump just doesn't want to talk about.
This is where I brought up national security before, because in wars, I don't know if it's a more generous interpretation, but this is sort of my thesis that it's some of all of those things, but also because I'm sure a lot of White House reporters, if they're listening to this, would take real exception to that, right? But I do think that there's just almost a human tendency to have a really hard time believing you're being lied to when it's happening to you in the moment, especially about important things. Like, the more important it is, the harder it is to believe that might be the case. And I think that's a trap that a lot of people fall into.
I think that is a very generous interpretation of
Okay.
the mentality that might be at work here.
Okay. Yeah, maybe it is.
I think to me, it is part and parcel of 10 years of failure by the media to adequately cover the stakes of Donald Trump and to take him both literally and figuratively in what he says as president.
How much does your work as a historian inform your perspective on this? Because that's sort of the other piece of what you do, right? You do these deep oral histories and look back on major world events with the fresh eyes of time.
Yeah, and I think there is some history that is particularly relevant to the story of the president's health. Not this president's health, but sort of the health of people in the office of the
Right.
president,
Right.
which is I'm going to put Joe Biden aside because I don't actually pretend to be able to mediate what actually happened or didn't happen during Joe Biden's presidency. But across the 20th century, we saw numerous instances where presidents were not entirely open with the American public about the state of their health. Most notoriously, we saw that with Woodrow Wilson and his stroke that left the presidency all but vacant, and the country was run by his wife for sort of large chunks of the end of his presidential term.
Mm-hmm.
In World War II and in FDR's presidency, we saw the press be a active participant in the effectively cover up that Franklin Roosevelt used a wheelchair. The press corps sort of tried to show Roosevelt and the presidency respect by not showing him using a wheelchair getting to and from speaking events, or, did not report that fact very openly in coverage of the presidency. And during John F. Kennedy's term, we saw both a presidential cover up and some complicity by the press corps around the regimen of painkillers and debilitating back pain that John F. Kennedy spent most of his life and presidency suffering from. All of which is to say, in the sort of 50 years since Watergate, we have gotten used to a much more vigorous level of reporting and inquiry on the president's health and the health of presidential candidates, even. One thing I would sort of submit to you is that we saw more aggressive coverage and investigation and bigger headlines when Hillary Clinton had a cold in 2016 as a presidential candidate
Mm-hmm.
at the 9/11 anniversary memorial services
I
that
remember
year.
the video of her seeming to collapse or have a hard time walking, getting into a van. Like, it's seared in my brain because it
Exactly.
appeared
And
so
then,
much on television at the time.
that was one of these moments that became a news event in a way that I think we have not seen sort of similar coverage in any meaningful way out of Donald Trump's health at any point over the last couple of weeks or months. Our entire push for the 25th Amendment came about during the nuclear age, when it was necessary to ensure that it was always clear who was in charge of America's nuclear arsenal. And that in any given 30-minute window, wherever he is, the president may be asked to initiate a series of conversations and actions, that imperil the entire existence of the human race. And that very much makes the president's competency and health and mental vigor the business of the nation and the world.
Before I let you go, you do a lot of oral histories. What do you learn from that style of history, from writing it and from reporting it?
Yeah. As you know, I just published my third book-length volume of oral history, following on a 2019 book that I did called The Only Plane in the Sky, that was an oral history of 9/11, and then a book that came out last year called When the Sea Came Alive, that's an oral history of D-Day. Had a book come out this summer called The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, which is an oral history of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bombings. And
in between, you've done oral histories on Bear Stearns' collapse, right?
yes.
You
I've done a bunch
stuff
of magazine stories
right.
about the collapse of Bear Stearns and the raid to kill bin Laden, and
Mhm.
the capture of Saddam Hussein and others. And to me, the power of oral history, and this is actually very, very relevant to the topic that we're talking about today, is the power of oral history is it lets you experience these big world events through the eyes of the people who lived them at a moment when they didn't know the outcome.
Right.
Trying to go back and capture what it was like to live these events, not knowing what would unfold across the rest of September 11th, not knowing whether the D-Day landing would be successful, not knowing whether Adolf Hitler would get the atomic bomb, or who actually would even win World War II. And I think that there's a tendency in narrative history to make events seem neater, cleaner, simpler, and more preordained than anyone felt at the time when they were living them. And here we are talking the week of September 11th. 40% of Americans are now too young to remember the events of 9/11. And if all you have done is read about 9/11 in history books, you learn sort of something like this. The events begin at 8:46 in the morning on Tuesday, September the 11th. The whole thing is over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the second tower at 10:28. There are 4 hijacked planes, 4 attacks, 3,000 people die. And all of that is factually true, but it skips over what it was like to actually live those events. And if you are old enough to remember 9/11, that's not the day that any of us actually remember living, because we didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when the attacks were over. We didn't know what came next. We didn't know how many attacks there were for most of the day. I mean, you have to remember, as late as 1 p.m. on September the 11th, the US government believed that there were still a dozen hijacked planes in the skies over North America. There was no sense that those events were contained only to New York, Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon. They evacuated skyscrapers in Los Angeles and Chicago and Boston.
Mhm.
Disney shut down. The Toronto subway was closed. And so if all you do is read about 9/11 in history books, you miss that sense of fear and chaos and confusion and trauma. And if you miss the backdrop of fear, chaos, confusion, and trauma, you misunderstand why America reacted the way that it did to 9/11. And so for me, the power of oral history is about re-injecting that uncertainty to the experiences of history.
Yeah.
And I apply that lesson to today and sort of wrap this back to everything that we were talking about across this episode, because I think one of the things that I worry about as a historian looking at the journalism we're living through right now is I think too much of our journalism today expects that the future is going to look similar to our past, and that sort of American politics, American government, America's future exists, within a standard deviation or two of everything that we have experienced in the past. And that doesn't have to be the case. And as a historian looking at this moment in journalism, what I worry about is that I feel like I am losing sight of what America's future could be in this moment. And I feel that that's a level of uncertainty and honesty that our journalism isn't adequately conveying to readers, to listeners, to the public at this moment.
I also wonder if, when you encounter reporters who are telling stories or describing what they experienced in real time, reporters at the time don't necessarily know what they don't know, right? And I wonder if that makes you more sympathetic to the journalists of today who are trying to piece together realities that we know that presidents are trying to keep secret, or if the takeaway is no, we know from history that this stuff is happening, that there are things going on that are bigger than what we see right in front of us, and you need to have a little bit more imagination.
Yeah, very much the latter for me,
Hmm.
which is
Yeah,
I
I
think
thought so, but I
yeah, that to me, knowing what we know about these subjects and how they have been treated in the past, that to me is the greatest inspiration one should need to be digging harder, deeper, faster than we are seeing the press drive forward on a whole bunch of these fronts right now.
Garrett, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
The Kicker is brought to you by the Columbia Journalism Review and produced by Amanda Dara. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.